People see an older man living alone and assume they're looking at the end of something, a decline, a quiet failure no one talks about. If that thought makes you uncomfortable, good, because discomfort is usually the first sign that a belief is about to crack. Men who stay silent know this moment well. The sideways looks, the lowered voices, the unspoken conclusion that your life must have shrunk somehow. And here's the tension most people never resolve. What if the silence they're judging is chosen not as resignation, as precision? There's a 69-year-old man named Cameron, retired, healthy, mentally sharp. One afternoon he overheard someone say he must be miserable living alone. Cameron didn't correct them. He smiled. Not politely, not defensively. The kind of smile you only wear when you no longer feel the need to explain yourself. Men who never explain themselves are often misunderstood first. But that misunderstanding hides something deeper, something we'll come back to shortly. Because living alone after 60 is rarely what it looks like from the outside. Most people believe solitude equals loneliness. That assumption feels logical until you've lived long enough to notice patterns instead of reacting to them. Older men who choose to live alone aren't running from people, they're filtering. After decades of relationships, compromises, emotional labor, and unspoken expectations, something shifts. You stop asking who wants my time and start asking who deserves my energy. That question changes everything. This is the first truth most families miss, and we won't fully unpack it yet. But here's the edge of it. Loneliness isn't defined by the absence of people. It's defined by the absence of meaning. Men who've spent a lifetime managing noise, the cost of constant company. Not every conversation nourishes. Not every presence brings peace. And when a man finally understands that, really understands it, he stops filling space just to avoid silence. Cameron once said something that doesn't sound profound until you sit with it. Silence doesn't scare me anymore. It heals me. Think about that for a moment. People who are afraid of silence rush to fill it. People who've made peace with themselves protect it. Psychology backs this up, though few talk about it honestly. Older adults who choose solitude rather than being forced into it often show greater emotional stability than those surrounded by constant stimulation, less reactivity, less anxiety, more internal regulation. But here's where the misunderstanding deepens. From the outside, selectiveness looks like withdrawal. From the inside, it feels like clarity. Men who notice patterns instead of reacting eventually realize something uncomfortable. Much of what once passed for connection was obligation. Much of what looked like intimacy was expectation. That realization doesn't make you bitter. It makes you precise. And precision feels threatening to people who rely on noise to feel secure. This is where the second layer begins to form, though most never articulate it. Living alone doesn't just remove company, it removes pressure. The pressure to perform, to reassure, to negotiate emotions that no longer align with who you've become. But we're not ready to go there yet. Because before we talk about emotional freedom, we have to sit with this question. One most men never ask out loud. When was the last time you were alone and felt calm instead of empty? If that question landed differently than you expected, pay attention. It's not an accident. Most people think emotional freedom means emotional distance. That's a mistake. Men who live alone later in life aren't shutting their emotions down. They're finally no longer managed by them. Here's the uncomfortable truth most families never consider. For decades, many men learned to regulate themselves around others. Their tone, their timing, their reactions, their silence. Their silence, not because they were weak, but because peace often required negotiation. Men who never explained themselves didn't start that way. They learned it. And when those negotiations disappear, something subtle but powerful happens. The nervous system relaxes. This is the second truth people miss, and it's where the real shift begins. Living alone often creates emotional freedom, not freedom from women, freedom from expectation. There's an important distinction here, and most people blur it on purpose. Older men who choose independence are not rejecting companionship. They are rejecting constant emotional accounting, the unspoken check-ins, the low-grade tension of being responsible for someone else's emotional state. The feeling that rest has conditions attached. Men who stay silent understand this deeply, even if they've never named it. When you live alone, your emotional posture changes. You no longer brace, and when the bracing stops, clarity appears. This is where many observers get uncomfortable, because clarity looks cold to people who survive on emotional intensity. But reduced drama isn't emptiness, it's regulation. Research consistently shows that lower emotional stress in later life correlates with improved heart health, better sleep, and sharper cognition. But statistics don't explain why this feels so profound. The reason is simpler and harder to accept. When a man no longer has to prove himself emotionally, he starts listening to himself physically. This leads us somewhere most people don't expect. Older men living alone often take better care of themselves, not worse. This is the third truth that surprises families. Without external schedules dictating their rhythm, many men finally align their days with their bodies. They eat when hungry, rest when tired, move when stillness turns heavy. That sounds obvious. It isn't. For decades, routines belong to someone else's needs: work, family, relationship expectations. Autonomy changes how the body speaks and whether it's heard. Cameron didn't decide to become healthier. He noticed he finally could. Daily walks appeared naturally. Meals became simpler, but more intentional. Sleep deepened. Not because life became easier, but because resistance faded. Here's the psychological twist most people miss. Self-care increases when control returns. Neglect often comes from overload, not isolation. Men who notice patterns instead of reacting recognize this shift quickly. They stop mistaking independence for risk and start seeing it as responsibility. But this is where the story usually gets distorted. People assume living alone means living without love. That assumption is emotionally lazy. Love doesn't disappear when romance does. It changes shape. Older men often cultivate quieter connections, friendships without performance, family bonds without tension, neighbors who show up without obligation. Some value companionship without labels. Others find meaning in service, mentoring, or community presence. Psychology is clear on this point, even if society resists it. Connection does not require cohabitation to be real. People who equate romance with emotional fullness often fear silence more than solitude, and that fear colors their judgment. Before we move further, sit with this question. Another one most people avoid. If love becomes calmer with age, why do we assume intensity is proof of depth? That belief cracks in later life, and when it does, something else replaces it. But we're not there yet. Because the final shift, the one that reframes everything, has nothing to do with people at all. It has to do with peace. And peace, once protected, changes how a man moves through the world. There is a moment most people never see. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't ask for validation. It happens quietly. Usually in the morning, an older man wakes up alone. No negotiation, no emotional recalibration, no need to prepare himself for someone else's expectations. And instead of emptiness, there's stillness. This is where the fourth truth begins, but most people never make it this far. Living alone does not mean living without love. It means living without distortion. Men who stay silent often understand something others don't. Love doesn't disappear when roles dissolve. It becomes lighter, cleaner, more honest. At this stage of life, connection stops demanding proof. Older men often maintain bonds that don't drain them. Friendships built on shared history instead of performance. Relationships with adult children that breathe easier without constant proximity. Neighbors who exchange respect instead of obligation. These connections don't need to be loud to be real. Society confuses visibility with value. If love isn't displayed, it must not exist. If there's no partner in the frame, something must be missing. But men who notice patterns instead of reacting see the flaw in that logic. Intensity has always been overrated. In earlier decades, intensity masked insecurity. It created urgency. It kept people distracted from deeper misalignment. Later in life, urgency fades, and with it the appetite for emotional turbulence. Here's the perspective shift most people resist. Quiet connection often means stronger connection. When love no longer has to prove itself, it stabilizes. It becomes reliable instead of reactive. This is why many older men prefer companionship without labels. Not because they fear closeness, but because they value clarity. Labels come with scripts. Scripts come with expectations. Expectations come with pressure. Men who've lived long enough know exactly how that cycle ends, but the real misunderstanding doesn't stop at connection. It sharpens around peace. This is the fifth truth. and it unsettles people. Many older men who live alone report a deeper sense of inner peace than at any other point in their lives. That statement irritates anyone who believes fulfillment must be shared to be real. But peace doesn't care about consensus. Aging compresses time, priorities sharpen, tolerance for drama evaporates. What once felt exciting now feels expensive. Living alone allows men to guard their nervous system like a finite resource because it is. Cameron said something once that stayed with me. I finally live at my own pace. That sentence only sounds simple until you realize how rare it is. Most people never live at their own pace. They live at the speed of expectation. When that pressure lifts, something fundamental changes. Research consistently shows that seniors who feel control over their daily lives report lower stress and higher life satisfaction. But again, data only tells half the story. The real shift is internal. When a man protects his peace, his decisions slow down, his reactions soften, his presence steadies. This calm is often mistaken for detachment. It isn't, it's discernment. But this is where we have to draw an important line, one most discussions avoid. Living alone is not always healthy, and pretending it is would be dishonest. There's a difference between chosen solitude and enforced isolation. Men who are pushed into aloneness without emotional support experience something entirely different. Warning signs exist. Deep sadness that doesn't lift. Neglect of health. Withdrawal from all connection. Those are not signs of peace. They are signs of collapse, and they deserve attention, not judgment. But here's the uncomfortable reality families often avoid. Concern becomes control when understanding is missing. Many older men aren't withdrawing. They're stabilizing. They're not abandoning relationships. They're recalibrating them. They're not escaping life. They're recalibrating them. They're not escaping life. They're finally inhabiting it. This is the moment where perception must change, because once you understand this distinction, fear turns into respect. And respect changes how you show up. But we're not finished yet. There's one final layer left, the identity shift that occurs once a man fully accepts this stage of life. It's subtle, permanent, and once it locks in, he moves differently. There's a point most men reach without announcing it. No ceremony, no declaration, just a subtle internal shift. They stop asking for permission. Not permission from others, but from the old version of themselves. This is where the misunderstanding fully collapses. Older men who live alone are often accused silently of giving up. But men who notice patterns instead of reacting recognize something else entirely. They've stopped bargaining with time. When you're younger, you negotiate with life. You tolerate friction because you believe there's more runway ahead. You accept emotional debt because you assume it can be paid later. Later never comes the way you imagine, so something changes. Men who stay silent begin making decisions that look selfish to people who still measure worth through sacrifice. But it isn't selfishness, it's final clarity. This is the identity shift families rarely see because it happens internally first. An older man living alone is no longer building a life to be witnessed. He's refining a life to be lived. That distinction unsettles people because once a man stops needing witnesses, his behavior becomes unpredictable to those who rely on approval as a compass. He eats differently, sleeps differently, moves differently. Not because he's isolated, but because he's aligned. Here's the psychological twist most people miss. Alignment often looks like withdrawal to people who live in friction. The engagement simply moved inward. When conflict disappears, observers assume engagement disappeared too. It didn't. The engagement simply moved inward. Men who've reached this stage don't argue to be understood. They don't correct assumptions. They don't audition their peace. They protect it. And protection requires boundaries. Boundaries confuse people who benefited from your previous availability. This is why families sometimes feel uneasy when an older man chooses solitude. It mirrors a fear they haven't resolved in themselves. If he's okay alone, what does that say about the stories we tell ourselves? This is where tension sharpens, because once a man realizes he doesn't need chaos to feel alive, he becomes harder to manipulate. Drama loses leverage. Guilt loses traction. Expectation loses authority. That doesn't make him cold. It makes him grounded. Grounded men don't rush. They don't escalate. They don't defend their choices loudly. They let results speak. And this is where the conversation usually breaks down. People want certainty. They want reassurance. They want guarantees that solitude won't turn into decline. But men who've reached this stage understand something uncomfortable. No lifestyle is immune to risk. Only awareness reduces it. Living alone doesn't create vulnerability. Unconscious living does. That's why chosen solitude often strengthens older men instead of weakening them. They notice their health sooner, their moods more clearly, their limits more honestly. There's no emotional camouflage anymore. And without camouflage, self-respect grows. This is the part no one says out loud. Self-respect increases when a man no longer compromises his inner pace to meet external noise. Cameron once described it in a way that doesn't sound psychological, but is. Nothing is pulling at me anymore. Think about that. No pulling, no tug of war, no constant recalibration. Just presence. Men who reach this stage don't disappear from life. They re-enter it on different terms. They show up when it matters. They leave when it doesn't. They stop confusing endurance with strength. And here's the quiet realization that settles in last. Peace is not passive, it's defended. But defending peace requires something most people never develop: discernment. Who gets access? What gets attention? Where energy goes? Once that system locks in, a man doesn't go backward. Which brings us to the final layer. Because once identity stabilizes around this understanding, the question stops being, is living alone healthy? The question becomes something else entirely. And answering it changes how you move from this point forward. At some point, the question disappears, not because it was answered loudly, but because it stopped being relevant. The question was never, is living alone healthy? That was just the surface version people felt safe asking. The real question, the one most men arrive at quietly, is this: who am I when nothing is pulling at me? Men who stay silent eventually discover something unsettling and liberating at the same time. When expectations fall away, when roles dissolve, when no one is watching closely, what remains is not emptiness, it's alignment. This is where older men who live alone stop being misunderstood and start becoming invisible to judgment. Because judgment needs friction to survive, and there's very little friction here. By this stage, a man is no longer trying to be impressive, he's trying to be accurate. Accurate with his energy, accurate with his limits, accurate with what actually matters. Now this is the final truth most people never reach. Living alone is not about being without, it's about being undisturbed. Undisturbed thinking changes behavior. Undisturbed routines change health. Undisturbed identity changes posture. Men who reach this stage move differently, not loudly, not defiantly, but decisively. They don't chase closure. They don't reopen old negotiations. They don't explain their happiness in language designed to comfort others. They simply live, and this is where families often misinterpret calm for distance. But distance isn't what's happening. What's happening is sovereignty. A man who has sovereignty over his time, space, and nervous system is not lonely. He's centered. He doesn't resist connection. He just refuses entanglement. That distinction matters because entanglement drains, connection nourishes. By now the patterns are clear. Men who choose solitude are not retreating from life. They're stepping out of unnecessary struggle. They're no longer confusing endurance with purpose or sacrifice with virtue or intensity with meaning. They've learned something most people don't learn until the very end, if at all. Peace is not the absence of people, it's the absence of internal resistance. And resistance fades when life becomes honest. Some men thrive in partnership. Some thrive in community. This doesn't mean every man should live alone. That was never the claim. Some men thrive in partnership. Some thrive in community. Some thrive in chosen solitude. The mistake was assuming one path meant loss. For many older men, living alone is not a consequence, it's a conclusion. A conclusion reached after decades of observation, compromise, adaptation, and self-correction. They are not unfinished, they are resolved, and once a man is resolved, he stops moving to be seen. He moves to be true. That's why the calm feels different here, why the silence doesn't feel empty, why mornings don't feel heavy. Nothing is missing because nothing essential is being negotiated anymore. If this felt familiar, if it named something you've lived but never heard articulated, then you already understand the shift. Once you see this clearly, you don't argue with assumptions anymore. You don't correct people, you don't defend your choices, you just move at your own pace, own